So I haven't had chance to talk about the spending review, but I was always going to leave it a couple of days anyway before we talked about it. And honestly, quite frankly, there's been so much stuff going on with those reform councils. It was just too good not to cover all the stuff that was going on with them. However, back to, of course, what Rachel Reeves has been up to. And we had, of course, the spending review that happened last Wednesday. And one of the things that was done very, very quietly is that Reeves has now potentially, quite interestingly, opened the door to become a lot more interventionalist when it comes to investing, spending alongside capital, but also now offering sort of guarantees to companies as well. And this actually potentially can really make us quite a similar model to what you see in countries like Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Countries that a lot of people I often hear say, that's what we should be more like. So this, I think, is quite exciting because hopefully in, I think, either a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months' time, we'll be finally getting that industrial strategy of how the government intends to invest in the UK to increase and what it's going to focus on for the UK. That will be quite interesting. And now you've got this. This says to me that we are going to have a lot more active government when it comes to making investments, partnering with capital to invest in projects. That is good. We've seen the success that has in places that people always say we should emulate. Let's be more like, the Nordic states. Well, here's something that they are doing like that. And as I've always said in my past, hey, if something works, in another country, why not replicate it? Why not emulate it, right? So here we are. We're going to dive into this because I think this is kind of interesting. That is definitely going to be bringing potentially quite some interesting changes depending on what we see in this industrial strategy that, again, is meant to be sort of coming down the pipe at some point. So, as always, before we do go diving into this, please do remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page, the one-off donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can buy me coffee, the YouTube thank you button, and of course, as always, there is the YouTube membership button down below as well. So thank you very much to all those people who do help and support the channel that way. So let's crack on then into this. Coming from the Byline Times, Rachel Reeves has now quietly ended the Thatcherite consensus and opened the door to the UK becoming a Nordic-style economy. It is gone little noticed by the media, but this week's spending review from the Chancellor made a series of changes, which amounted now to a fundamental rejection of the Thatcherite economic model Britain has operated under since the 1980s. Buried in the report is the news that Starmer's government is planning now to increase the funding, or capacity in the jargon, of a swathe of public sector financial institutions, including some of the new ones launched by this government. It said the government now is fostering an entrepreneurial state, which will support businesses, investment, and capitalize growth. The financial transactions will allow the government to invest alongside the private sector, following through with equity investments, loans, and even guarantees, the document states. This may all sound very dry, but it opens the door to becoming for the UK to become a much more activist state, something that we'll see much more through the minister's very long-awaited national industrial strategy, likely to come out in the next couple of weeks. The language now in this spending review gives a taste of what's to come, saying the government's financial rules recognize that financial assets held by the government, encouraging investments that support growth while generating a return for the exchequer, will be delivered largely through the expert public financial institutions, including the National Wealth Fund and the British Business Bank. Reeves changes now to the fiscal rules, now, of course, much looser than, of course, first indicated when the party entered office. Gee, isn't that something I said quite a lot? How, gee, these rules seem quite lax when we saw this. And yet I remember so many people having a go at me saying that all this was bad. But honestly, I would say, given this, what we're potentially seeing here, I'd say it's quite good. I agree with this. I would say this is very good because we are becoming a lot more interventionist state through this. And time and time again, I've seen people say we should emulate the Nordics. Well, this is kind of what they do in the Nordics. So, but equally, I haven't seen too much people talk about this either. So, this will now also mean a much more scope for an activist investing state than before, because these new measures will measure now the national debt, places now much greater value now on assets held by the state, such as public sector stakes in private firms, which again, I think would be good. The previous rules from the Institute of Government do note that the government could appear now to improve public indebtedness by selling off the kinds of long-term assets, even if it did so below their true market value. This created the incentive now for governments to game the rules, for example, by selling the student loan book, as happened back in 2017. A major incentive now for privatization has gone because the rulebook now properly values investments held by the state not as liabilities, but as assets. And that is a fundamental change. We should really note that you now have a government that looks, we are going to make investments. We are going to not, take risks, but we are going to acquire assets that will in turn generate wealth for the exchequer. That is quite a fundamental change in the way that we are seeing this. That is a big fundamental change in the way this is happening. So these changes have, of course, led the new government now to increasing the financial firepower of now publicly owned financial institutions by around £40 billion, or by 40% of this parliament, to 137 billion. Reeves will, of course, want to be remembered for this and her desire now to foster an entrepreneurial state. In other words, now to Scandi-fy the UK economy. More Norway, less USA. The government will now, of course, proudly expand equity investments, loans, and guarantees, for example. There are, of course, few public sector firms which will be very pivotal in this mission. And, of course, the big hitters are perhaps unexpected. One, of course, new publicly owned institution has, of course, received a lot of attention. That would be Great British Energy. And I really do have a lot of hope for Great British Energy. I really do love the fact that we have this now. And if you factor this in with Great British Energy investing into building renewables, I think we could look back maybe in a couple of years' time and look at the success story that Great British Energy has been. And always remember, wind back the clock again a year ago almost, and you had a lot of people saying, Great British Energy, no, all that's going to do is give a lot of money to private shareholders, and that'll be it. If this does succeed and it creates and invests in, builds energy, renewable projects, this will be good. This will be very good for the country. Because guess what? Under these new rules, the government's going to have a stake in owning these assets. Notice what I said there, assets, because that is what they are. And you've got a government here that has changed the rules, changed the language to recognize that type of thing, that type of investment as an asset to the country. I think the industrial strategy looks to be, I think, quite interesting when we're going to get it. And I can't wait. I genuinely cannot wait to get it. So back to this. Of course, the new publicly owned institution, Great British Energy, by Ed Miliband, is of course launching with 40 billion capacity now to invest in and build renewable energy projects across the country. Again, and build, very important. A lot of people don't realize that. Public funding, of course, for the Great British Energy nuclear, of course, a rebrand from Boris Johnson's Great British Nuclear, takes, of course, the toll now for 8.3 billion from this parliament, with a share of the state taking a much bigger role in developing nuclear energy. And again, I do believe we should develop nuclear energy. Nuclear energy, we do need it. It is the stopgap that can provide a heck of a lot of power for us when we need it. And developing that is very good. We had a previous government that all it did was invest in gas. And look where we are now. Part of the problem, why energy prices are so high, is because we had a government that went all in on gas. So it is, of course, the totem for the government's green energy investment push, but it could also now end up investing less in renewable energy projects, less than, of course, now reportedly publicly owned bodies. The British Business Bank is, of course, getting far more financial firepower too, 26 billion just in this parliament, compared with GBE's 4 billion. That is an extra 10.3 billion pounds for capacity on this government. This is a 67% increase from under the Conservatives. Most of that, of course, will be loans and equity in private firms. In other words, now the state is becoming partners in commercial enterprises, fueling startups now and promising industries. Again, this is the type of thing we can say, and if the government starts to sort of fuel this, starts to get good enterprises up, starts to sort of fuel those promising industries, that's a win-win for the UK. The UK, of course, Export Finance is, of course, another big winner. This is a ministerial body which will provide guarantees now for UK goods and service exporters now to try and win business abroad. Again, building markets abroad, very risky for businesses. Very, very risky for businesses to try and do this. Trying to get into a new market abroad is incredibly hard. Incredibly hard, because you're not only having to compete with the domestic market, which is, again, always traditionally very strong, but you have to then compete with every single other exporter who exports into that market. So having a ministerial body like this helping to win business abroad, that could actually win big dividends down the line. That is a very good, significant long-term investment. So anyway, continues. In doing so, it will also encourage UK firms now to invest overseas by providing insurance and protections against loss. It is also getting, of course, 20 billion additional now capacity now for this parliament on the Labour's plans. This is a 33% boost for its total capacity from 60 to 80 billion. And finally, we have the National Wealth Fund, which receives over 5.8 billion extra. It is an extra rather than, of course, new. It is, of course, actually a rebranding of Boris Johnson's post-Brexit institution of the UK Infrastructure Bank. While its clout is, of course, rising to 27.8 billion, making it now the second largest now of four key publicly owned financial institutions being bolstered by the Labour government. Its spending power is now heavily weighted towards loans and equity, with, of course, no guarantee component. In simple terms, this means it is now prioritizing taking direct stakes in private firms. This will, of course, be used to work now on focusing on strategic investments, helping to deliver the government deliver growth, clean energy missions, and generate a return for the taxpayer, and providing in a crowded now private capital. All of these now indicate a very big shift in Britain's industrial strategy. One, of course, promised by Labour, but of course soon now start to bearing fruit. A move to a more social democratic economy. When you look at the big picture, nationalising passenger rail services, nationalising the energy systems operator, and of course, new government big spending on AI, up to 500 million for creating a new UK sovereign AI unit to support the emergence of a national AI champions, and of course, now the near doubling down of spending on social housing over the next 10 years, a pattern emerges. This government is starting to shift the dial away from the neoliberal US-style economics, and is starting to look far more towards our neighbors now on the North Sea. And I agree. You cannot take all that big picture and say, that's bad. There's a very clear pattern emerging here. We have now government that is starting to use state power to say, we are going to invest in this country, and we are not only going to help provide businesses, we are also going to take stakes in these businesses as well. And this has been, again, something that a lot of people have championed for a while, saying, why do we not follow that type of government? Well, here we are following that type of government. And I will say this now, I am very, very, very much looking forward to when we get that national strategy review. I am very, very much looking forward to when we get that. That will be very interesting when we get that. But we await that, of course. So let me know what you think to this down below. I think, honestly, this is quite good. I think this is a very dramatic change when it's happening with government. But again, that's what happens when you change government. You get these types of things. And I think that you do have this type of very significant change where you're having a government saying, that is an asset. We are going to take stakes in it. We are going to invest in that type of stuff. We are going to help, British businesses, startups, you name it. There is a very interesting pattern forming here. I'll be very interested to see how this develops, how these institutions develop, and eventually how this all will eventually bear fruit. So we will see what happens in due time, of course, but we'll be keeping an eye on these things. So, as always, let me know what you think down below, and of course, we'll see you all next time.